This week's show is brought to you by Blake Griffin's Assists. Just as good as a point guard, but from a power forward. Welcome, everybody, to another Boxscore Geeks show. I think we keep with tradition. Whenever I miss a show, Patrick has to miss the next one. I don't know why. It's unrelated. Patrick's actually sick, whereas I actually had work that kept me out in the last week. All right, we are full-fledged into the playoffs, and we're going to be talking a few things related to that. And then I'm just not going to let sleeping dogs lie, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened last week on the Boxscore Geek show. I'm your host, Andres Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers, and with me, as always, is our fabulous, wonderful, exuberant. I'm running out of adjectives. I'll think of more for next week. Brian Foster, who you can find on the Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Give a shout out, Brian.
Thanks for the introduction, Dre. That's a hard word to say, actually. So is exuberant, so I'm not even going to try. I'm going to throw it back to you.
All right. Well, you stumbled a little, but we might be talking that a little later. So anyway, I just want to jump right into it. Those of you who are listening, I forgot to tweet it out. So if you're watching live, congratulations. Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about the Floyd Mayweather fight, and then, of course, some of the out-of-the-ring issues surrounding it that you talked last week. We're going to talk the Clippers, particularly Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan. And then we're going to talk your own Steph Curry. Excuse me, I almost sneezed there. Your own Steph Curry, who, just took home the MVP hardware, which, I thought was touch and go, but would have been very disappointed if he didn't. So with that said, sorry, I'm trying to get some stuff up in front of me. Let's talk Floyd Mayweather. So you and Patrick last week went into this. And so the basic issue is Floyd Mayweather has a lot of domestic abuse cases outside of boxing, and these aren't like hearsay. That's one of the issues that runs in celebrity circles, is that celebrities can essentially get away with doing horrible things because they never get convicted. It's all, the victims are afraid to come forward. That's not the case with Floyd Mayweather. On his record, it's kind of the same as Ray Rice. The police record just clearly shows that he was in the wrong. And one of the people you brought up last week was Stephen A. Smith. Patrick did a fantastic Stephen A. Smith impersonation. But Stephen A. Smith just said some essentially outrageous things about it. And I wanted to address a few of those. The first is, one of the things Floyd Mayweather did to one of the women he abused, an ex-wife of his, or ex-girlfriend, I believe, is he stole her cell phone. Now, as Patrick discussed last week, this is a very common attack. This is a very common tactic among abusers because it isolates the victim. It basically keeps them from being able to call for help, and it puts them in a position of kind of embarrassment where they have to step forward. I'll link some stuff on domestic abuse and how it's not. People have the wrong idea about it, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. Stephen A. Smith came to the defense, I guess, which is ludicrous, by saying it wasn't a grand larceny charge, because that's what happened. Floyd Mayweather got charged with grand larceny for stealing her phone because it was just an iPod. As Patrick pointed out, it wasn't an iPod, it was an iPhone. When there is a big difference, especially between the two. And the grand larceny charge was fine. Now, one of the things Patrick did on last week's show was talk the cost. And in the comment section, people were basically saying grand larceny wasn't $300, which I believe was the estimate Patrick brought up. Just a clerical note, when this occurred, it was in 2010. The iPhone was relatively newer then, and it is not hard. In fact, I know for a fact it's not the case anymore, but my iPhone right here, when I purchased it all the way vamped up, meaning all the memory, all the perks, and it was over $500. And a lot of people don't realize when you buy a phone on a plan, the 2-year commitment, they waive the cost. So basically, it was not even the slight bit outrageous to think that Floyd Mayweather stole something that was easily worth in the neighborhood of $500 to $1,000 from his ex-girlfriend, and he did so in a manner for very unscrupulous means. Stephen A. Smith, no leg to stand on the fact that he basically said he couldn't believe that Mayweather would lay hands on a woman when the facts were 100% different. The fact that he said iPod instead of iPhone when it's, again, completely different. Essentially, I'm going to say you crashed and burned, Brian, and I may be in the same boat on this discussion. But you kind of tried to say there's a point which is ESPN kind of wants characters. One of the things we always compare to is professional wrestling. And the sense being that ESPN wants characters that say sound bites that are essentially like wrestling heels that are supposed to get the audience against you. There's something to that, but the problem is when ESPN has people essentially making things up, which in this case, Stephen A. Smith, this is where you're allowed to come down on him harshly, was making up facts and obfuscating the truth in the case of iPod versus iPhone. That's where it just gets inexcusable to me. Where ESPN, even though, as Dave Barry always points out, the E is for entertainment and the N is not for news. The simple fact of the matter is that ESPN is not legitimately a news organization, which is just the unfortunate truth. You shouldn't go there for your news. They do try and portray themselves as such, and when you have one of your reporters essentially lying, this is Fox News-ish, to me that is unacceptable. And that's kind of where I end up there on Stephen A. Figured I'd give you a chance to hop in because I think you've said this before, and here where I'm drawing the line is I agree with your general point, Brian, when you say Stephen A. Smith says outrageous sound bites to get a rise out of people. So, like, as Patrick was saying, the guy in the bar saying, everybody knows that Russell Westbrook's the greatest player ever. And when people disagree, he just shouts louder. Fine. I don't have a problem with that. But in cases like these, where he's saying things like the woman was asking for it, the woman should speak down, downplaying what actually happened, that's where I get offended. And I think a lot of people on the internet do, and I think they're right to. And if ESPN in any way excuses that, it's unacceptable on both their part and Stephen A's.
No, and I can't disagree with anything you said there, Dre. I think, I didn't do the best job communicating my point mainly, but I think it was mostly that if I may have said this on the show, if a bus hits Stephen A tomorrow and he's just gone out of the picture, ESPN doesn't have him anymore, they're going to throw some other guy up there to do the same thing he did, right? So I think the main thing I'm trying to caution about here is if people want to pile on Stephen A, fine, but I'm just think there's bigger fish to fry than him. He's, like you said about the other issue, maybe he's more of a symptom than the root.
Oh, that is so. By the way, that is fan. I'll give you that point. Yeah, that didn't come across as well last week. Like when I was listening, even on the show, Patrick was like, "Really, Brian? You've got a counterpoint to this?" I think you're right, which is to say, in a lot of cases, in professional sports particularly, and Floyd Mayweather's going to come up here, there are problems that come up, and what essentially happens is a scapegoat goes up. This is really common with coaches getting fired. An organization is just a terrible team, right? They're never going to win with how they're constructed. They're never going to win with how they're acquiring talent. They're a horrible team. And so what ends up happening is they lose 10 games in a row, and the team fires the coach and hires a new coach and is like, all better. And you look at them and you go, that's not going to fix anything, right? You still don't have any good players. Every year with your top 10 draft pick, you pick a horrible player. It doesn't matter. So I think to your point on Stephen A, you're right. And the other problem is ESPN kind of covers itself, right? Because it'll release news reports where it condemns Floyd Mayweather while having Stephen A going at the same time. So they can kind of say, no, we don't agree with him. But I think to your point, it's very clear that they are fine playing both sides of the fence if it means they get views.
That's right. They want both sides. That's why they're doing what they're doing. You're totally right.
So, but I think to the point, it's fine to be mad at Stephen A. But if you're going to be mad at Stephen A, I think this is the point you were making. You have to be mad at ESPN. They are not like, it's not as if what he wanted to say, it's not as if he's some crazy person that is coming out and spouting nonsense that ESPN is not allowed to get rid of because he has some contract. He is saying this because, and he puts it by some editor somewhere, and they're like, do it. That's going to get us page views. That's going to get us clicks. That's going to get us views. All right.
Yeah, that's my main point. And I'll push back a little bit on you there, too. Even being mad at ESPN, what is ESPN? They're a corporation, and their board, is trying to make money for the shareholders. That's what they exist for. So if they see an opportunity to do it, they have to show a lot of restraint to take the moral high ground, I think, as opposed to their corporate goal of making money. So, of course, we all wish they would and actually be diligent about it, but I can understand why they don't. And not to excuse it, but corporations are what they are.
I think it is fair in this point, and that's where people should push back. And I think to your point, it might be worth noting, tweeting at Stephen A. Smith is not going to solve anything. Hit ESPN if you own stock in them, whatever. Speak. I don't want to say sell your stock. I actually want to say if you own stock in ESPN or Disney, you can talk to them. You're a shareholder. You can bring up your concern there. So do that. All right. So the other weird thing about the Floyd Mayweather fight to me is obviously his, I guess, off the court behavior is inexcusable. But what makes it really weird as an outsider watching, I didn't watch the fight. I'm not a boxing fan, is that boxing is an utterly barbaric sport, and it's up there with football. Where I think before the show when we were talking, as I phrased it, it essentially strip mines the minds and bodies of young men for money, and in many cases, those young men are minorities. And there is something very odd about watching that makes it weird for me to watch people on the one hand condemn Floyd Mayweather for beating a woman, which he should be. It's completely unacceptable. And then simultaneously cheer him. And in fact, not only cheer him, people were upset with how Floyd Mayweather fought because he fought defensively, right? He didn't like not like I saw someone point out that like Floyd Mayweather hasn't knocked someone out in a while. So you have people simultaneously saying it is unacceptable for Floyd Mayweather to beat the crap out of another human being, which is true. And then at the same time saying, I can't believe Floyd Mayweather didn't possibly give this other person a concussion. And I've got Brian just silent. Like I think before the show, I was talking to Brian. I was like, this is another hole we can dig ourselves. And if Brian, if you don't want to approach it, I'm fine with that.
No, it's a tough one. It's really tough.
I mean, I think we kind of even as the people who are outraged about things in sports, about owners, about athletes, it's just I think you're right where it's worth putting in perspective. And I always get a little trepidatious when the fans get outraged at an individual person when the industry as a whole, so boxing as a whole, just as an industry, basically gives a lot of young men concussions. And one of the offshoots, this is something Arturo's brought up before, is one of the offshoots of getting concussed is acting in manners that can be very harmful to the people around you. If you watch, I believe, watch and read League of Denial, it's really tragic to see what happens to these former football players when they try and live normal lives and they've had so many concussions that their brain just starts breaking down. They lose memory function, and one of the uncomfortable truths is that they actually can get violent towards the people around them. I think we've talked about this a couple times now, but there is a wrestler by the name of Chris Benoit who killed himself after basically he did a homicide suicide where he killed his wife and children and then killed himself. And I believe they got his brain for research, and as we mentioned, concussions. Chris Nowinski, who's a former wrestler who's done a lot of research into this, basically it's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, I believe, CTE. And basically it's where the brains of people in high impact sports like boxing, football, professional wrestling, their brain basically deteriorates worse than someone with Alzheimer's. And one of the side effects of their brains deteriorating is them basically losing memory function, losing cognitive function, becoming violent towards people. And what WWE has essentially done with Chris Benoit is wiped him from history. I was listening to Jim Ross podcast where he basically said he doesn't think Chris Benoit belongs in the Hall of Fame. And basically what they're doing there is they're putting the blame on Chris Benoit when we have to be candid with ourselves and say the actual activity of professional wrestling could have put him in the state that had him in such a position to do that. It's very uncomfortable. This is very hard to deal with, I accept. And so what we have to accept is if you're a fan of boxing or football or professional wrestling, and these people act in horrible manners that can both possibly, and I said possibly, so I don't know on Floyd Mayweather's case, be explained by the actual activity themselves and then are not uncommon for many of the athletes. People forget that we've basically forgiven Kobe Bryant and Ben Roethlisberger for alleged rape because they've won some titles. And so I get very conflicted when I see a lightning rod against an athlete for acting egregiously, because I know that the people that are acting outraged are simultaneously ignoring that similar behavior in other athletes. Ty Willingham's, a friend of the blog, tweeted about Raging Bull and about how Robert De Niro's character basically had these issues before. It is not uncommon to have these issues in professional boxers. So it's like when you turn a blind eye to something that is very symptomatic of a sport and act as if this one person, this one thing, like you were saying with Stephen A. Smith, this one individual is the perpetrator, that the only person doing this and everything else is pure and innocent. I don't know how to deal with it. It's just very hard outside looking at it. I don't think we're not, by the way, just for anybody listening, we're not going to come to any conclusion. We're not going to come to any solution. We're not going to condemn anybody, including ourselves. It's just very difficult to watch.
Well, we can still condemn ourselves. That's fine.
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, we'll condemn ourselves. Like I constantly as a sports fan have to deal with the fact that I simultaneously root and in some cases aggrandize people, right? When I write articles about this great performance out of this player, except that I may also be talking about someone who has done horrible things as an individual. And that's really, really hard cognitive dissonance to deal with. And if you're a sports fan, you just have to accept that. There is nothing pure about sports. The people in the old days were not saints. The person that you really like that doesn't have a
Oh, let's see if we're losing Dre. Okay, we got you, Dre. You're back.
A year, 10 years, something is going to come out of it. Okay. So anyway, all I was saying is the thing about sports is the players in the old days weren't saints. The people that we like that we haven't heard stories about, there's nothing to guarantee that they're saints. We like these people because they are very good at athletic endeavors, and we have to be very careful not to try and connect that on a moral basis to that same individual. It's called the halo effect, where you like one aspect of an individual and you try and apply it to all of them. And I think we have to be very careful about that. And then we also have to be careful, which is to say, I have nothing against if you're outraged at Floyd Mayweather, but you can't turn a blind eye and act as if that problem is not symptomatic across boxing and indeed across a lot of professional sports.
Absolutely. And, the more I think about when you put it that way, that's probably my bigger overall point about Stephen A. Smith and ESPN, too, for this whole issue is that's what the media is trying to do, right? They're trying to create narratives. ESPN wants to draw in kids, maybe not for boxing, but in general, they want the next generation to be ESPN watchers like everyone else. They want to boil everything down to the simplest level of good and evil, and they have this huge murderer's row of, serious guys to talk about how serious all these issues are, right? We're going to bring in Skip Bayless, we're going to bring in Stephen A., and we're going to break it down to the very simplest black and white. But the problem is we have all this data now. These are big, complicated things we're talking about, and if you look at the reality of all these situations, CTE, domestic violence, whatever, they're such complicated issues, and no one network reporting on it is going to be able to actually do it justice in a way that will fit their narrative and sell stuff. So, yeah, it's just the wrong... ESPN is kind of the wrong stage to address these issues.
100%. I mean, like, even when I was saying, like, baseball, one of the things that bugs me, for instance, is Alex Rodriguez just got 660 home runs. And in his contract, he's supposed to get some bonus money because he ties with Mays' record of 660, I think, for fourth on the all-time hitting list. And Dan Hirsch put a great tweet up where he just put asterisks where he talks about Bonds, Aaron, Ruth, Mays, and A-Rod. And he said, the asterisks are for PEDs, amphetamines, and only playing against white people. I think I'm actually going to change the order up. I'm going to get us off this topic. I think we've talked enough. If you want to hear more, put it in the comments. We'll talk more next week. I want to talk a little bit about Steph Curry, who just won the MVP. And one of the things, this is an article I may write, and me talking about it means it's much less likely for me to write it. Sorry. But I think on a few shows ago that Steph Curry, there's only one season by Michael Jordan that was better than Steph Curry's season this year, according to the points over par metric. And I think Steph Curry may very well be a better player than Michael Jordan was at this point. And certainly, Michael Jordan and Steph Curry were both two players that were on two amazing teams. The 1992 Bulls and the 2015 Warriors are the only two teams to have the three-point line at the current location and have a point differential above 10 when you adjust for strength of schedule, which is ridiculous. And the reality is Steph Curry had more to do with his team's accomplishments in that season than Michael Jordan did on his 92 squad.
But look at all those qualifiers, Dre. Why can't you put it in black and white? Get off the fence, Dre. Oh, sorry. I was channeling ESPN for a moment.
Actually, we're gonna talk a little bit about that. So, but what I find is I actually tweeted that out, and former number one fan of the show, Evan Zammer, he was a big fan of the Wages of Wins. I don't know if he's a big fan of Boxscore. Geeks actually retweeted me, and I think he was being a little incredulous when I made the point that I thought basically Steph Curry had a season that was better than all but one of Michael Jordan's seasons in his career. And I think the thing is, we are very, very tempted to believe that things in sports, this is just a very common thing, used to be better. That the sport has become more unpure, that players used to have more skill, that the game used to be pure and everything's getting ruined and yada yada yada. And for instance, the link I gave you is Steph Curry. Oh my God, by the way, last week on this show, every time Patrick mispronounced Steph Curry, even after acknowledging it, Steph Curry and Kawhi Leonard. Uh, yeah, oh, I got it right in the first try. Steph Curry and Kawhi Leonard. These are two players that we just butcher their names regularly. The defense I'll give is if you watch the Kia MVP or Defensive Player of the Year award to Kawhi, the person butchers his name so badly. I was like, I felt so vindicated. I was like, oh my goodness, we have never said his name that poorly. I'll include the link. But anyway, Steph Curry is the only player in NBA history to shoot more than 8 3-point attempts a game and score over 44% from beyond 3-point line. That is absurd. And actually, to your point, like ESPN, I find that a lot of, I'm going to call them, I just dropped his name, but over at Advanced NFL Stats, Brian Burke, he came out a while ago, basically, and I ended up calling these Brian Burke stats, where he gets really mad when you have the ESPN announcers that says, by the way, do you realize that Peyton Manning is 100% on third down passes in the month of May when playing against East Coast teams? And you have to put so many qualifiers. You go, that's stupid. And anybody that's looked at the basketball reference play index tool, you can do this, right? You just keep qualifying things, right? You're like, I want to look for players with over 500 attempts that have shot better than this, that have done less than this. And you keep whittling and whittling and whittling until you get the one player and you can say they have this many assists, but this many blocks, but this many steals and this many points. I'm saying this is a very simple stat. Steph Curry had the greatest 3-point shooting season in the history of the NBA. And that is among one of the reasons he is a legitimate MVP. Like, I think if you look at the points over par metric, I believe he's top of the list on per minute. And we kind of talk this. It's very hard because you can go back and forth. You can say he didn't play as many minutes as James Harden, so is James Harden more valuable? But the reason he didn't play as many minutes as James Harden is because he played so well when he played that the bench could come out. And it's not a metric that we can quantify as being good or bad. But I'm just saying on a per minute basis, Steph Curry was the best player in the league according to our numbers this year. He is the greatest 3-point shooter in the history of the NBA. And I like that. I like when you give the MVP to someone that basically has done something that hasn't been done before that isn't a Brian Burke stat. Meaning, if it's the first player to get like 20 points and 20 rebounds a game, which will never happen again, I'm okay giving that person the award for that. So I love, love, love Steph Curry winning the award for that. He is just an absolutely absurd player that we have not seen the like of, that I actually believe, at this point is a better player than all but I think it's 88 or 89, all but one of Jordan's seasons. And it remains to be seen. Part of Jordan's greatness is that he was great over many, many years, and we'll have to see if Steph Curry keeps this up. But I find when you bring that up, right, when you go, Steph Curry is playing better than Michael Jordan right now, you could make the same claim for James Harden, people bristle because they believe Michael Jordan was the greatest and no one will ever reach that level again. And that kind of bugs me. And it's understandable in Steph Curry's case why people don't get it, because his points per game are lower, but his points per game are lower because his shooting efficiency is so ridiculously good. He doesn't need to take that many shots and he passes the ball. So I think Steph Curry at this point is playing better than Michael Jordan was at his prime in all but one season. And I hope it keeps going.
All right, well, I have to have some kind of a counterpoint here. I can't just let you get away with that. But
I want to put you on the spot to all the listeners who are new to the show this week. Brian Foster is allegedly a Warriors fan. So come on, Brian. Warriors
allegedly,
fan.
but I'm a bigger fan of, just being difficult and arguing with people. So
fair enough. Okay,
no,
that's what we got.
Well, so your point here is that people get nostalgic for the past, right? And they think that it's not the way it used to be, right? But then guys like us, I definitely believe this. We're in a much better era than we've ever been. We're a lot more scientific about shooting three. I say we, I should mean the actual NBA players. They know they need to shoot threes. They need to not do isolations, not take, fadeaway 2 point deep 2 pointers. They need to shoot at the rim. And on top of that, Jordan was a shooting guard and not a point guard, so he didn't have his hands on the ball quite as much. Although,
Oh
come on,
no,
he's Jordan. He
if
dominated
we
the ball.
if we had the SVU stats,
Okay, okay.
Jordan would have held. I mean, you could argue like Steph Curry and Jordan are two players. By the way, that is one thing that made Jordan really really good too. He passed the ball a lot as well. If you're going to talk about these meld guard positions, like I put them both as the same. Allen
Fair
Iverson,
enough.
Jordan, Steph Curry, they're all this kind of like shoot first guard, right? That's going to dominate the ball.
If I'm just saying, if Jordan were on the Spurs right now playing with Popovich and he was only driving to the basket, shooting threes, and passing, would he be even better than he had been?
I this is something that's come up, and it's not true for all the sports, but basketball is a little different. So, for instance, in baseball, the issue you run into is there were a lot of subpar pitchers, and the people that were really dominant, like Ty Cobb, who over 400 batting average for a season, which will never happen again. Basically, the sport caught up. And what you can look at, there's a great author named Stephen Jay Gould who talks about this population, where if you take the population and it's, there's a population distribution and you smush there's an upper bounds, there's an upper bounds to human performance. So if you take a population distribution and push it towards that bounds, basically what you're going to notice is the performance of the people is just going to get closer and closer together. And this happened in a lot of sports, right? Baseball, some of the best baseball players back in the day would just not be as good in the modern baseball era because the pitchers have improved, other batters have improved, fielders have improved, etc. The NBA is somewhat true to a degree, right? We've gotten international players that have come in, we've gotten better training. But on the same note, my belief is that superstars from previous eras, if given access to modern coaching, modern medicine, modern conditioning, if you read about the ABA in Terry Pluto's Loose Balls, what's hilarious is how many of these players, smoked cigarettes and stayed up all night partying the nights before games, and were, obviously, crack was a major, or cocaine, not crack, but cocaine was a major issue in the 70s and 80s for basketball. So basically, I think previous stars with modern technology would still dominate. I don't know if they dominate to the degree. Certainly, if you look at Magic Johnson and Dennis Rodman in the 80s, I don't know if we'd ever see those levels again, but I do think Michael Jordan would still dominate.
Yeah, absolutely.
But all I'm saying is it bugs me a little when you have modern players that play great and you say, I think these are better than former greats. This happens in baseball as well. And people get all defensive. Jordan was great. I'll give you that. But I do think that there are players in the modern NBA. LeBron James, at this point, like LeBron James's career is on par, is an all-time great. He's had a better career than like Larry Bird, for instance, at this point. I'd put him close to Magic. I'd probably, this is rough. I think I'd put LeBron James's career above Michael Jordan's at this point. And okay, so by the way, something else I got into on Twitter this week. Sorry to be all over the place, Brian. I want to
Let's
talk
do
a
it.
little bit about. So let's get on to the Clippers. But before we get on to the Clippers, we've got a nice tangent into it. Tracy McGrady. So the reason people defend Michael Jordan as the greatest of all time is his titles. And I've discussed this, and I will write this in an article. The fact of the matter is, Jordan's second three-peat was a lot of happenstance. Essentially, what happened, the two major factors were because Jordan retired, Horace Grant left the Bulls. Because Horace Grant left the Bulls, there was a void at big. The Bulls needed to replace him. Phil Jackson in his book has said he basically had a list of 10 bigs he wanted. Dennis Rodman was 10th on the list. But Dennis Rodman was in a front office dispute with the Spurs, and they wanted to trade him. So the Bulls, if they wanted Dennis Rodman, had to act quickly. So basically, a player that wasn't first on the Bulls list came available, and they took him because if they waited, they weren't going to get him. So that they lucked into Dennis Rodman. The NBA shortened the three-point line, which essentially, if you look at Jordan's numbers, that was the only time in his career he was really that efficient from three. Basically extended the life of Jordan, and then was also kind of a cheat code for the kind of team the Bulls had constructed with Jordan, Pippen, Tony Kukoc, and Steve Kerr. So essentially, the Bulls lucked into the greatest power forward ever, lucked into the rules basically favoring their team, and that got them the second three-peat. It's not to diminish Michael Jordan's career, as is regular season, ignoring the playoffs, is the best shooting guard of all time, and I would argue among top five, top 10 NBA careers. So I'm not taking that away from him. But everybody uses his titles as kind of the tiebreaker among these other players, including LeBron James. But the simple fact of the matter is a lot of that was luck out of Michael Jordan's control. And if we look at individual performance, LeBron James, I would argue, has had a better career than Michael Jordan. Sorry. Now, a player that comes up in this kind of weird realm, two of them, in fact, are Chris Paul and Tracy McGrady. Now, Tracy McGrady had a career of just not getting out of the first round. And what bugs me about this is if you compare Tracy McGrady to, say, Kobe Bryant was drafted by, the Hornets at the time and traded to the Lakers, and the Lakers were like a 50-plus win team with Shaq. Tracy McGrady, right, went to Orlando, which wasn't a good team, and then, ended up on Houston, and then Houston was always injured. So a lot of Kobe Bryant's success in the postseason just had more to do with circumstance that he had no control over, right? That required teams trading. So a stat I want to bring up on Tracy McGrady is Tracy McGrady couldn't get out of the first round. Now, this happened 3 times against Detroit, with Houston against, sorry, my dog is very excited about this, and Houston against Utah. And these 3 cases, the games went to game 7 in round 1, and Tracy McGrady just, quote unquote, couldn't get out of it. Now, what I want to talk about is in all 3 of these series, in a series deciding game, Tracy McGrady put up a double-double, he put up like against Detroit, he put up a 37-point, 11 rebound, 5 assist game in game 6 when they lost and didn't take it down in game 6. In game 7 against Dallas, he put up a 27-point, 7 assists, 7 rebound game. They lost and didn't advance. And then in game 7 against Utah, he put up a 29-point, 13 assists, 5 rebound performance. Didn't advance. It really bugs me when people will try and point to postseason success at a player to diminish them. And Tracy McGrady is a player that in 3 series deciding games put up MVP performances. His team didn't hold up, and that's why he didn't advance. This kind of logic bugs me. It's one of the reasons I hate postseason success as a tiebreaker for greatness among players. It's like, Steve Nash and John Stockton, Charles Barkley, they never won titles. That does not diminish their spot in terms of all-time greatness.
Absolutely. Those guys are all great players. Cannot disagree with you there.
And so the same becomes true with Chris Paul, where basically Chris Paul was drafted by now the Pelicans. I forget, were they the Hornets at the time, right? And this team just wasted his talent. They didn't surround him with anything. They basically had one good season with a healthy Tyson Chandler, but they wasted his talent. He didn't do well. And again, I was talking to someone about this too. He was talking about the Nuggets not succeeding, with the George Karl Nuggets being underwhelming. And that is true. But at the same point, if you look at the Western Conference over the last decade and a half with the Lakers, the Spurs, the Nowitzki Mavericks, the Nash Suns, these have had some of the greatest teams in NBA history, I would argue, all at the same time, making the Western Conference one of the most competitive ever. I compared it to the Attitude Era in wrestling. You just have all of these all-time greats at the same time. It makes it really hard for me to be upset with good teams that just didn't get as far as we would want when they were playing in such a great era of basketball in a conference. Also makes me a little bit upset about the Eastern Conference. It's not to say the Eastern Conference hasn't created some great teams like the Celtics, the Heat, and, even the Cavaliers now. But it's just fair to say those conferences were not as competitive as the West has been.
Yeah, I don't know where you're going with this. So are we going to talk realignment again?
Well, I don't know. But basically what I'm going to say is I can't really hold it against Chris Paul to not be as successful as, say, Kobe Bryant as why he's not a greatest point guard of all time. And that will actually lead me into the Clippers. The Clippers are a bizarre team. So I think Doc Rivers is a horrible GM. The talent he has put on that team, he's up there with the Thunder. We've talked about this on other shows. But the Clippers have 3 great players. They have Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, and DeAndre Jordan. And one of the things we noted, I forget the podcast, but we were talking about Blake Griffin, and I basically said a comparison that Patrick, he didn't mean to make this, was Vince Carter, where both Blake Griffin and Vince Carter had good starts to their careers and looked poised, if we look at the age curve, to make a jump. And neither of them did in the year. This was the year we expected a jump out of Blake Griffin. I think it's fair to say he was injured. And in the first round of the playoffs, Blake Griffin played absolutely absurdly. I just put this post up today. Basically, Blake Griffin's passing was at an elite point guard's level while playing next to Chris Paul. His rebounding was at an elite bigs level while playing next to DeAndre Jordan. And he was basically shooting like a shooting guard. Now, his numbers went down a little from his regular season, but it's worth noting he was playing against one of the best defenses in the league. So Blake Griffin's performance in round one of the playoffs, now again, small sample size, I accept that, was just utterly absurd. And that was also one of the reasons I got to Tracy McGrady, is I saw Tracy McGrady's performance next to Blake Griffin and went, oh, Tracy McGrady had this great first round in Houston that didn't get out of the first round. You can't blame that on Tracy McGrady. So the Clippers are a really scary team because their bench is horrendous, but they have one of the top strongest top three in the NBA right now. And you could almost look at this like not the Cavaliers, the Miami Heat, where they kind of atrophied, their bench and depth atrophied, but LeBron James, I'm going to be mean, Ray Allen, and Dwayne Wade, those top three basically kept them in it, and they were able to, I would argue, steal one from the Spurs.
Oh, sorry, I was muted.
Nothing. All right.
Sorry, I'm working on stuff, Dre. No, it's true. The thing that gets me is how we distill it down to that one moment. I mean, this is the big kind of gulf between, analytic thinkers and mainstream thinkers, right? This is one of our biggest points, is that people will take that whole regular season of both the Spurs and the Clippers, and and what we would say is, well, these are two equal teams, right? They had similar records. They went to Game 7, went down to the very end. Statistically speaking, we should just consider them to be two equally great teams, and that's it. But that's never the way the commentary goes, right, amongst the fans and whatnot. It's, well, Chris Paul made that 1 second shot. He's an all-time great. Wow, what a great player he is. The Spurs are ready to retire. And if that one shot had gone different, it would have been the opposite, right? Chris Paul's a choker, blow up the Clippers. Spurs can play into their late 40s. So,
well, EJ Fisher brought this point up, I think, when we talked the Spurs a while back, where he was just like, okay, the Spurs basically had the title up to game 6, I think 2 years ago. And then Ray Allen makes like 2 impossible threes and they lose. Well, did the Spurs legitimately jump from being the best team in the NBA to not the best team in the NBA just based on those 30 seconds? Is that really what you want to make your basis on, and not the 82 regular season games, the 20 playoff games between both teams? No, just that 30 seconds.
Yeah, and that's it. And then somehow being clutch or choking, something we can't measure even though we try, will trump, all 82 of those games.
So, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much my point there on, I mean, the Clippers, Chris Paul, he's an all-time. Chris Paul, I would say at this point for me is the third best point guard, at least with modern stats that we have, because it's hard to compare to old ones. Third best point guard ever, and he would legitimately be the best point guard ever if it weren't for the fact that Magic and John Stockton were just two of the most absurd point guards ever. And same point, I think the Clippers are really scary, but if the Clippers don't make the title, I think the simple fact of the matter is I think there were, I would argue, maybe 4 or 5 legitimate MVP, NBA championship quality teams. When I say MVP, I should have said most valuable team. Quality teams in the West this season, and only one of them is going to win a title. That does not diminish the fact that, like, to your point, how good the other ones are. Now, to be fair, though, the Warriors, the Clippers, and the Spurs were head and shoulders above the rest of the NBA in terms of performance. So if we're going on regular season, we should really hope for a Warriors versus Clippers showdown.
All these other things get thrown in there too. Like, here's one other thing that gets me about postseason is that for some reason there's a narrative that injuries don't matter. That
what's just
no, there is that teams and coaches will say, well, we're a no excuse basketball team. We don't care if Mike Conley's out. But the truth is, the Memphis is probably going to get destroyed by the Warriors, and not having Mike Conley is a big reason for that.
Oh, that's
So
huge.
it's
And I mean,
huge.
you could argue, I mean, the simple fact of the matter in the NBA is the NBA is one of the most star-driven leagues. Now, what you can do, I'll give a shout out to someone. So somebody said that Steph Curry was, or someone gave Klay Thompson a vote for MVP on their list and said, must be trolling. And my response was, I said, maybe they just did an all Warriors MVP vote. And frankly, that's not that offensive as an idea. I would take I would take an all Warriors MVP ballot for MVP over anybody who votes for Melo or Kobe. Just I'll be honest. Sounds mean, but it's true. So,
That would be
um,
popular on social media. You should spread that around.
all right. So anyway, you can have a cheat code and just have a really, really deep, really, really strong team. But the NBA is star driven. And if there's a player that you need, Kawhi Leonard, just look at the Spurs without him and then with him. And don't tell me that that didn't matter. Don't tell me that the Spurs aren't wishing they had 10 more games of Kawhi in the regular season this year.
Yeah, and in fact, I haven't looked at the full numbers for that series yet, but I believe Kawhi had an overall poor series. So that could have been part of it, when they lived and died by him, basically. When he was hurt during the regular season and played poorly in this playoff series, they couldn't win.
Well, I mean, they
But
went to
again, it
set.
was so close to being a win.
But then also, like, this is where it also gets rough. It's usually really hard for NBA players to impact each other, right? Dave Barry always brings this point up, and it's my favorite. LeBron James is the best player in the NBA. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows the rule is stop LeBron James from getting to the hoop, stop LeBron James from passing to those players that are open. Why don't they? Because he's just that good. So when you actually have teams that can shut down other teams' great players, that's when it's something special. And I mean, the rough part about this is this San Antonio Spurs Clippers game could legitimately have been the NBA Finals if you didn't have conference, right? If you seeded by something else. If we had done a playoff seeding, just so you're aware, this season by point differential, the Spurs and the Clippers would both be top seeds, and they would, have met late in the tournament if this was like a bracketology thing. But it wasn't. So you can't tell me, right? These were two great teams that managed to do, have great performances out of stars, hurt other stars. You can't, yeah, this postseason, you can't take that away from either team.
I do agree. We should get the NCAA selection committee to seed the NBA playoffs. That would make it more fair. I'm being sarcastic, but that's actually true the more I
Are
think
you
about it.
sure about him not having a great first series?
Maybe not. I could be wrong. Again, I was just listening to the games. I wasn't actually looking at the numbers.
He shot 57.1% true shooting, got
Good.
20 points per game, 7 rebounds per game, 2.6 assists per game, 1.1 steals, zero point 0.6 blocks, only 2.1 turnovers. I think it's fair to say, dear listeners, that Brian Foster did not watch any of the
Wow.
Spurs games, hates Kawhi. Send your hate mail to Boxscore Brian on Twitter. He deserves it. EJ Fisher, I expect a scathing letter to the editor about Brian's just utterly slanderous takedown of Kawhi, who did not deserve it for such a great first-round series.
Well, the eye test is all that matters, and they lost the game. So that's my counter to that argument.
All right. By the way, I don't really have a good spot for this, but it is really interesting. So I'm going to give you, I made a post about this today, but Blake Griffin has me in this weird spot where I want to talk a little bit about floor spacing. Because normally I really, 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 going to say one more, really, really hate the floor spacing argument because it's usually used to defend players like LaMarcus Aldridge and Carmelo Anthony and Kobe Bryant and Allen Iverson, because I'll basically say they take all of these shots and they're decent, but they're not great. And they shouldn't be taking this many shots, especially with the teams around them. What's their problem? Now, Blake Griffin is an interesting position for me because I've seen some stats about his mid-range shooting. He's basically really good from mid-range, but the problem with that is if you're really good from mid-range, you're still not as effective as a decent three-point shooter or a decent person at the rim. Basically, someone who shoots like 60% at the rim is still doing better than someone who shoots 50% from mid-range, whereas that 50% person from mid-range is like the top 1%. That 60% at the rim is not a good shooter at the rim relative to other people at the rim. But the cheat code and the difference I'll give you is that Blake Griffin's passing rate is absurd. And the general argument people give me when they talk about players like Melo taking all these mid-range shots is, well, they're spacing the floor, they're opening up better shots for their teammates. And the reason I hate this argument is because I go, well, if they're opening up better shots, their teammates actually have to take these better shots. But Blake Griffin actually has a lot of passes, and one of his teammates, DeAndre Jordan, get has a so DeAndre Jordan, I sent you a link for this too, Brian, has an absurd stat this season. He is the only player in the history of the NBA to take over 500 shots, have a true shooting percentage above 60%, while also having a free throw percentage above, or not above, below 40%. And basically, DeAndre Jordan's cheat code is he gets a lot of shots at the rim. Well, I can buy that Blake Griffin is opening up good shots for DeAndre Jordan because of one simple stat on Blake Griffin's sheet, his assists. And this is one area, just so you're aware, if you look at the points over par calculation, basically when we take the assist, we basically credit the person who takes the shot with the full value of the shot and the person who does the assist with the value of the assist. This is something Ari Caroline has asked about, and a good question. You know, I don't tend to like a lot of criticism we get because, candidly, and this will sound mean, a lot of it is just bad criticism. It's not well thought out. But a good thought out criticism is to say, should Blake Griffin be getting more credit for those assists? And candidly, I can't actually see a problem with that. And so if we're going to talk about a player spacing the floor, if we compare Blake Griffin to LaMarcus Aldridge, Blake Griffin actually passes the ball. LaMarcus Aldridge does not. Some of the shots that Blake Griffin's teammates are getting are so high efficiency that I can easily buy the benefit of him spacing the floor that way. So, by the way, this is one of those corner cases where I'll actually say Blake Griffin, his numbers this season relative to what I expect were a little underwhelming, but I'm debating if he's not better than his numbers suggest by a decent margin. What I should stress there is, when I say better or worse than numbers, there are cases, particularly with defense, where I think a player might be better or worse than their box score numbers suggest. But typically, when we look at defense, for instance, it's not going to be that much. Blake Griffin, though, is a player with his passing where I might argue that he might be much better than his numbers suggest. And if he stays healthy, this top three, DeAndre Jordan, Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, may not only be one of the greatest top three in the NBA, it may also be the case where they're one of the best synergies, where their three talents actually work together really well. Because it's possible, to be honest, LeBron James next to Chris Bosh, next to Dwayne Wade was not a good thing because all three of them had a lot of strength from shooting. And when you reduce Chris Bosh's, the number of shots he was taking per game, you actually reduced his effectiveness. Same with Kevin Love in Cleveland. Whereas when you have these three players, Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan, and one of them, DeAndre Jordan, doesn't need the ball that much, and one of them, Chris Paul, is willing to pass a lot. That's actually pretty good synergy, and it actually pains me to see Doc Rivers in charge of the rest of that team. If you gave those three players to Greg Popovich and asked him to build a bench around it, I think you could hit 72 wins 3 seasons in a row.
Yeah, and I love that last point because we often, when a player plays less minutes and so they produce less overall wins, we tend to say, well, let's not blame that on the player because, it's the coach's fault for reducing his minutes. But at the same time, even if it's not the player's fault, the team still did suffer that lack of production.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the problem is if you're the Cavs and you get, well, first off, any team, there are two players, there might be more, but at least two that I know of. Actually, Kevin Durant counts too. So 3 players next season that I would give you, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Chris Paul, are 3 players that you just take no matter what. Doesn't matter what else you need. And by the way, in general, if you have a shot at a superstar, you take the superstar and figure out what to do next. But the Cavaliers, basically, as soon as they got LeBron James and Kevin Love, either needed to reduce Kyrie Irving's shooting or trade Kyrie Irving for a different kind of point guard. And they didn't. And when you have Kyrie Irving and J.R. Smith and Deion Waiters taking all these shots, and you have Kevin Love, what you've basically done is you've just wasted the lotto ticket. You got a lotto ticket and you wasted it. So there's both sides, right? It's hard to blame. We can only tell you what happened. This is the case with Dirk Nowitzki. Ari Caroline has typically come to the defense of Dirk, where if you look at Dirk, he's really a small forward. His skill set, what he does, he should be a small forward. But we can't argue the fact that Dirk Nowitzki has traditionally been played as a power forward, except when he was next to Sean Marion. Dirk has always been rolled out as power forward. I think that's because the coach sees a 7'1" player and says, you should be a big. Well, Dirk Nowitzki is going to get burned because we're counting him as a power forward, but we can't really, that's what the team chose to do with him. So we can't go retroactively and say, well, if he had been a small forward, here's how he would have played. Maybe. And so it makes it really hard, to your point, right? We can say this player was probably better than their numbers suggested, but they were in a bad system. That said, we can't go back in time. We can't change that season.
Yeah, and just to clarify for some of the listeners that may not be familiar with Ari's work, maybe you could explain a little. What he's basically done is said, well, all players, not just Dirk, but him specifically, he produces all these three-pointers and good outside shots. He doesn't produce as many rebounds, so therefore we're going to give him position based on his numbers, not what the book says.
Exactly. So basically, what you have in the NBA is if you look at any box score, you're going to see two guards, two forwards, a center. And a coach rolls out a lineup. You can go to 82 games and see what lineups they rolled out. Well, the coach is putting each of these players in a given spot. You can argue for tweeners, right? Guard forwards, forward centers, whatever. But basically, they have assigned positions they go out. What Ari's saying is that you could just look at responsibilities and say, certain positions are expected to pass more or shoot more or rebound more. And you could redefine a player's position based on what they do. So you could basically say, Sean Marion was getting sent out as a small forward, but he's really a power forward. He's playing like a power forward. Blake Griffin, the reason I loved this last season is I have no idea what to call Blake Griffin. Like Blake Griffin and Larry Bird and Magic Johnson and what's his name? LeBron James are players that, you couldn't give them an assigned position, but they do so many ththings that you're like, I don't know what to call them. They pass like a point guard. They rebound like a big. They shoot like a shooting guard. What the heck is this player? And so that just to that point, it gets really hard when you're trying to grade a player as something because we know that guards versus wings versus bigs have different expectations. And as such, we shouldn't grade them all the same. But you get into murky territory with certain players, and Dirk is one of them, where it's hard to know what you should really be calling them as a player. And Ari has done some great work looking into that.
Oh, see, I'm muted again. Absolutely, Dre. It's the funny thing is, I was just looking at that article and showing it to the viewers. It's 3 years out there now. 3 years ago, he originally proposed that Nash equilibrium. So I don't know if we've gotten anywhere with this since then, but we're still fighting the good fight.
Yeah. Also, I just because I have it up in front, I can't believe you called Kawhi's series bad. You're fired, man. You are.
I must have been brainwashed by Kevin Harlan and everyone else on TNT.
Oh my goodness. Now, just kind of a last note that I want to make on both MVP and NBA championships. And the funny thing is, I can't make the metaphor I want to make because the actual real world is stupid. Which is, I was going to say, it's like movies that win Best Picture. Just because a movie wins Best Picture, the year that it comes out can have a lot to do with it. So, if you come out the same year as, say, Goodfellas and you don't win Best Picture, well, that doesn't mean you weren't a good movie. It just means there was a greater movie. Now, by the way, the reason this metaphor falls flat is Goodfellas didn't win Best Picture. Dances with Wolves did. And so if you go back through the history of movies, and I think Cracked has talked about this, you go back through the history of Best Pictures, the movies that we have in our cultural conscious as being the all-time greatest movies, a lot of them did not win Best Pictures. And if you look at the movies that won Best Picture, a lot of them do not hold up really well at all. But it is the same thing for me where it's just, you can play in a year with other great players, right? If you look at the 80s with Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley and Larry Bird, Dennis Rodman never got the credit, but he was still there, and David Robinson, you have all these great players, right, playing at the same time. Not winning MVP does not mean you weren't one of the best. Oh, Karl Malone too, by the way. Does not mean you weren't one of the best players ever. Same thing with greatest teams, right? There are, I would argue, the Spurs and between the Spurs, Clippers, and Warriors, two of those three teams is going to go home. And the reality is, two of those three teams are, among the best in NBA history, right? Having a point differential above 6 is really good. And we have three teams this season with that, and two of them are going to go home not as champions. That does not diminish that. And and the same thing with Chris Paul and Tracy McGrady. It really bugs me when people go on this winner-take-all mentality in sports as if to say that diminishes the greatness of other people. It doesn't. That's all I got. And the East is really stupid, and I can't believe that the Wizards may very well make it to the finals. That's really stupid.
Yeah, the Buffalo Bills were one of the best team of the '90s, but they're always considered to be losers because they had those three Super Bowl losses in a row, or was it two maybe?
It
That's
was
so
four. It
ridiculous.
was
It
four,
was
dude.
four. Those teams were so
They
good.
made it to four back to back. They made it to
Yeah,
four consecutive Super Bowls. You cannot call, and the same thing too about like the Nash Suns. You cannot tell me that team was not a
that's
good
right.
team. So,
That's right.
all right. Well, with that rant to end, I'm ready to take us into shout outs, Brian, unless you have anything else to add. All right. So, do you want to go first or do you want me? Actually, let's do Patrick. So, Patrick, he's actually knocked Sheridan Hoops before, but Patrick has a tweet from Jim Park at Sheridan Blog. This was the important part is this was said on October 15th, 2014. And for those of us that at the beginning of the season said Westbrook was going to fall flat on his face, or how dare they not trade Clay for Kevin Love? For those of us that said predictions like that, take a look at this prediction. Jim Parks said, "My bold prediction for the Warriors this season: top 5 offense and defense, top team in the West. Curry gets 50, 40, 90, and the league's MVP." Just, I hope he took a parlay bet in Vegas, is all I can say, because, oh, wow, that's heck yeah, amazing, great work. And I really just, history, like I said, if we look at history, the only time a team that has played this well has not successfully won an NBA title is the 72 Milwaukee Bucks. And that's because they played against the 72 Los Angeles Lakers, who were another team in the same bin.
And even if they don't win the title this year, Dre, they're still an all-time great team.
Yeah, one thing worth noting to even like with the Hawks being down, or even if, say, the Clippers struggle, is it's worth remembering that the 2008 Boston Celtics, who are one of the greatest teams in NBA history, just you look at the numbers, they're one of the best teams ever. They almost lost in the first round of the playoffs to the Atlanta Hawks and then went on to have one of the most dominant wins in NBA history in the finals. So, again, the playoffs are just this really weird middle ground where these tiny things can bump you, and I'm not going to use that to take it away. Take away. So, you can't take away the amazing Golden State Warriors season. You can take, you can take the Warriors out of Oakland, but you can't take this amazing Warriors season out of Oakland.
Oh, thanks, Dre. I know you've got my back along with Kevin Draper, everyone else out here in the East Bay.
All right. And so I'll just finish up my shout out. So I already mentioned Dan Hirsch for his great point about, the purity of baseball. And, there was a time in baseball history where black people weren't allowed to play. There was a time in baseball where it was just common for everybody to be taking amphetamines. They were called greenies. They used to basically be in candy dishes in locker rooms, I've heard. There was a steroid era in baseball. Let's get over ourselves and stop acting as if certain eras of the sport were pure when they weren't. All right, my last shout out is to Christopher D. Long, who you can find on Twitter as @Octonion. And he said, Hack a Shack is the name that would have kept Radio Shack in business. Love it. And he's a great follow. If you don't follow him, he's got some great stuff. He's one of the best quants on the web. I think he's done some work with the Rockets. Just a really funny follow.
Yeah, just to follow up on that Greenies point, the first time I remember hearing about it was in the book Ball 4, one of the old school baseball, but, well, not that old school. I think it's from the 70s maybe, or 60s. But, yeah, it was a first-hand account of, all that, what went on in the locker room back then by the players. So it was really interesting stuff.
Awesome. Okay, and so your last
My shout-outs? Oh, yeah, I do have one shout-out this week. All Warriors all the time, of course. So this shout-out is to Tony Allen, who lost to the Warriors, but in doing so, he inadvertently walked through the middle of a performance by some kids dancing. And look at this kid go, man. He can dance. Tony Allen does not care, though. He just walks right through it. So, it is a shout-out. He was so focused on the game that he didn't care about all the other festivities. He's a player that I love to watch.
Fantastic. All right, so that is our show. If you found this show via podcast and not the site itself, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. If you haven't yet, you should subscribe to us. We are on both Stitcher and iTunes as the Boxscore Geeks Show. We also host the video show every week. I host that on channel Nerd Numbers. I have a playlist for it, so Subscribe to channel Nerd Numbers, and if we forget to tweet out when the show is going live, which is typically Mondays at, let me see if I can get this right, Brian, 9:30 Eastern. Is that
That's right. 9:30 Eastern, 6:30 Pacific.
Sorry, we span multiple time zones as a group, so it makes it really hard to keep track of things. So Mondays at 9:30 Eastern is when we typically go live. You'll get a notification of that. And so with that, we'll see you next week.